ध्वनिर्वर्णा पदम् वाक्यमित्यास्पदचतुष्टयम् यस्याः सूक्ष्मादिभेदे वाग्देवीं तामुपास्महे।
The Electronic Media Production and Research Center EMPRC of Madhya Pradesh Bhoj Open University presents an audio program of English literature. This audio program will be useful to the student of BA first year. This audio program is based on the 7th unit of first paper titled Literature in English from 1550 to 1750 AD. The title of audio program is The Sonnet. To deliver the lecture on this topic, we have invited our subject expert, Dr. Shubra Thripathi. Sound edited and presented by Amar Bahadur Yadav. Now let's listen to the audio program, The Sonnet.
Hello friends, I welcome you all to this session. Today's lecture is about the sonnet. This lecture is meant for first year students of BA, those who are studying English literature as their major subject. The topic is from the 7th unit of the first paper entitled Literature in English from 1550 to 1750. So let us now begin talking about the sonnet. As you know, students, that this is a topic which is related to poetry, and our objectives in this lecture would be that by the end of this lecture, you will be able to define poetry, explain the features of poetry, distinguish between various features of poetry. You would wonder why we are talking about poetry first. Well, of course, since the sonnet is a form of poetry, therefore we would be talking about poetry first. Then, by the end of this lecture, you would also be able to tell what is a sonnet. You will be able to describe various features of a sonnet and also describe the history of the sonnet. So, friends, let us first understand what do we mean by the term poetry. Before I ask you and you give me an answer, it would be nice if we talk about how various famous poets have described poetry. Dr. Johnson, a very famous English author, said that poetry is metrical composition. Another very famous poet, whom I think was prescribed at various levels of school, and I'm sure you must have heard of him or read him, is William Wordsworth. And he said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Another very famous English author, Carlyle, says that poetry is musical thought. Another very famous poet and a friend of Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he described poetry as antithesis of science, having for its immediate object pleasure. And Matthew Arnold, another very famous Victorian poet, said that poetry is the most delightful and perfect form of utterance. So friends, these were the various ways in which people defined poetry. But suppose I ask you that are all these definitions that we gave you, are they adequate or do they really explain what is poetry? I'm sure if you were given a chance, you would have described poetry in a different manner. Perhaps you would have said that poetry is something which has music, which is like metrical composition. Then maybe you would have said that it has some rhythm, the way nursery rhymes, which you studied or learned at the nursery school or primary school level, they had a lot of rhythm and that was poetry to you. Then perhaps some of you might say that they are beautiful lines which are easy to remember, which stick in your memory, which appeal to your heart. So that would again be poetry. Then again, you could say that poetry has rhyme. It has lines which rhyme together. But what about those which do not rhyme? You do have poetry which is called free verse, which does not rhyme. So poetry can be that literature which rhymes or which does not rhyme. It may have vivid images. Now, what do we mean by vivid images? Here, we are not talking about images physically, we are talking about mental images. A clear, vivid mental picture would be vivid images in poetry. Then, you could say that poetry is that literature in which a poet uses certain devices. He uses certain techniques which bring about beauty in the lines that he is writing. And then yet again, you could say that these poetic devices can be figures of speech. So, these are the various ingredients. The list is not complete. It is very exhaustive. You can go on finding so many different features of poetry, but these are some of the common ones which, if are present in a piece of literature, you can term it as poetry. So, if we want to see what exactly we mean by all these things, we can take 4 lines from a very famous poem called Lucy, and this was written by William Wordsworth, the famous romantic poet whom we had just mentioned. Let us read these 4 lines. A violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. Students, do you feel that these lines had some music? And of course, they have a certain rhythm. And if you want to see the rhyme of the lines, you see the last word in the first line, which is stone. It rhymes with the last word of the third line, which is one. It's not a very perfect rhyme, but it does rhyme. And the second line ends with I, which rhymes with the last word sky of the fourth line. So you can say that the alternate lines are rhyming together. Then of course we talked about images. The poet here says, a violet by a mossy stone. What is a violet? A violet is a very small but a very beautiful flower. It is something like a pansy, and it is rarely found in India, of course, but you do find it in some of the hilly regions. So the poet is talking about a violet which is growing by a mossy stone, a stone which is covered by moss, and it is half hidden from the eye. Can you think of a reason why this flower would be hidden from the eye? The reason is very simple. The leaves are very broad and the flowers are very small, so they are usually hidden from the eye. The second comparison or the second image is that of a star. Fair as a star. The word as shows that something is being compared to a star, and it is very fair, it is very beautiful as a star. And what kind of star? When only one is shining in the sky. So if you have a multitude of stars, then perhaps the beauty would not be so great. So here there are 2 comparisons, 2 images, one of a flower, the other of a star. So we saw that the lines had rhyme. The words stone and one rhymed. They ended in the sound N. Then you had sky and sky which rhyme. It had a certain rhythm or meter. What do we mean by meter in a poem? Just as you have the sur and the tal in Hindi, in music, similarly you see these are the stressed syllables in the line. When we utter the line, we put some more force or stress on these parts, and therefore we call them stressed syllables. These stressed syllables determine the rhythm or the meter in the poem. In any poem, meters can be of different kinds, and when we talk about sonnet, each sonnet will have a different meter. We will talk about it later on. We talked about imagery or images. We said that the poems had first image of a flower, the second image was of a star. Now these images were simile and metaphor. So imagery is a kind of poetic device. It resorts to figures of speech. Simile is when you compare something and use words like as, like. For example, as beautiful as a star. It is a simile because we are explicitly stating the comparison. But if we, instead of saying as beautiful as a star, we simply say a star, then it becomes a metaphor. I make it more clear. Suppose I give you an example and say, life is a walking shadow. Life is normally not a walking shadow. Shadow is something which is different and life is something different. But if we want to compare the transient or the ephemeral quality of shadow, then we say life is a shadow. It becomes a metaphor. But if we say life is like a walking shadow, then it becomes a simile. So if we compare something and state the comparison very explicitly using words like and as, then it becomes a simile. Similarly, we have other figures of speech, a paradox, which is something which is opposite in character put together, juxtaposed together, or if we have same sounds being repeated, it is called alliteration. So you have different figures of speech, you have different poetic devices. There are many more assonance, consonants, and so on and so forth, which the poets resort to in order to create poetry. We talked about rhyme and we said that certain words were rhyming together. What did we mean? Rhyme means similarity of sounds in the final syllable or syllables of two or more lines of a verse. Or, in other words, you can say the last stressed vowel and all the sounds after it must be the same. Then, in that case, we say that the words rhyme together. For example, you have honey and money. You have house and mouse. So, can you perceive that there is a similarity in sounds? Then we talked about rhythm and we said that rhythm and meter, they are essential to poetry. Rhythm would mean a movement that occurs at regular intervals of time. Friends, do you know that English is called a stressed timed language? What does this mean? This means that stresses or stressed syllables occur at regular interval of time. So, if we want to determine the rhythm of any poetic line, we say that stressed syllables occur at approximately regular intervals of time, irrespective of the unstressed syllables. No matter how many unstressed syllables are between two stressed syllables, the time taken to utter these stresses would be approximately the same, and this would constitute rhythm. Let us take, for example, a very beautiful poem of Coleridge, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It is also prescribed in certain schools, probably in class 10th or maybe 9th. Now here there are certain words or parts of words and they have a mark which is like a vertical dash. This is called a stress mark. You will find this mark in dictionaries also. And the syllable, what is a syllable, by the way? A syllable is a part of a word. It may also be a word, but it has one vowel sound and certain consonant sounds attached to it. So here, every stressed syllable has this vertical stress mark. If you consult a dictionary and you want to look at the stresses in a word, you will find this mark there. That means any part which follows this mark will be the stressed syllable. Let us read this line with proper rhythm. The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mayst hear the merry din. Can you see the movement, the rhythm in these lines? The rhyme scheme here was A, B, C, B. What does this mean? This means that A was one particular kind of sound, the sound of wide, eyed. This was the last sound, vowel sound. Then you had another sound, kin. This was different from eyed. This was in. And then you had set. This was the third sound represented by C. Et was the last sound. And then you had din, which was the same as kin. So this sound B was repeated here in the fourth line. So this is how we represent the rhyme scheme in a poem. Every new sound is represented by one alphabet, small letter of the English alphabet. Let us see another line from Shelley, another very famous romantic poet, and this title of the poem is To Night. He's written a poem dedicated to night. Here let us see how the rhymes have been used. Swiftly walk o'er the western wave, spirit of night, out of the misty eastern cave, where all the long and lone daylight thou wovest dreams of joy and fear, which make thee terrible and dear. Swift thy flight. Now, as you can see, you have wave rhyming with cave, night rhyming with light, fear rhyming with dear, and flight rhyming with night and light. So what would be the rhyme scheme of this poem? Can you tell the rhyme scheme? Suppose this first sound we say A, and night is the different sound, so we call it B. So the rhyme scheme would be A, B, A, B. Now this is a new sound, C, C, B. So the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, C, and B. So now if you are to discern or find out the rhyme scheme of the sonnets that we are going to talk about, we would represent them with these small letters A, B, C, so on and so forth. Now we have understood what is poetry. Let us now come to kinds of poetry, because we are going to talk about the sonnet form. And if we want to talk about the sonnet form, surely it is a kind of poetry. So let us see what are the different kinds of poetry. You will often come across a word lyric, the seventh unit in which we place this topic sonnet. You will come across this other term, lyric. What is a lyric? Lyric is a kind of poetry which was meant to be sung, accompanied by a lyre. Lyre was a musical instrument. The sonnet, of course, we are going to talk about it. It is also a kind of poem which is lyrical in character. That means it is musical in character. Ode. Ode is a poem in which you kind of exalt something, or we talk about something in high terms. For example, the poem To Night, which we just saw. Elegy. Elegy is a poem of mourning. Then you have epic poetry. You have epics in other languages also. For example, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. In English, a very good epic is Paradise Lost, written by Milton. Milton is prescribed in the second unit of your syllabus. And then you also have ballad. The example, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which I had just referred to earlier, is a kind of a ballad. Ballad means a poem which is in the form of a story. That brings us to the sonnet, which is the focus of our attention in this particular part of the lecture. What is a sonnet? Oxford Advanced Learner's Dictionary defines the sonnet as a type of poem containing 14 lines, each of 10 syllables, and with a formal pattern of rhymes. That means the sonnet is a piece of verse consisting of 14 decasyllabic lines with rhymes arranged according to one or other of certain definite rhyme schemes and expressive of one main idea. Now from here you can make out that certain features are essential for a sonnet. So what are these features? These features are that a sonnet must contain 14 lines. All the sonnets which were written in Europe, in England, they contained 14 lines. This is essential, neither more nor less. They are addressed to someone. The poem, sonnet, is always addressed to someone. You have the feeling that the poet is talking to someone. He's talking, whatever he wants to say is to be said to someone, not the reader, some other character. And then there are lyrical poems, there are musical poems which express one idea. There's one central theme. Then sonnets in earlier times were primarily love poems. Why I say earlier times? Because when the sonnet form developed, they were love poems. But later on, Shakespeare and Milton, they used this form for other kinds of ideas also, and so did other later poets. Several sonnets were arranged in a sequence. The earlier sonnets, they were large in number. Every poet who exploited this form wrote several sonnets, and they were usually addressed to one or maybe a group of people, not more than 2 or 3, and they were arranged in a particular sequence so that you could find a certain pattern among them. Let us see the history of the sonnet. I just mentioned Shakespeare. I also talked about Milton. Let us see how this sonnet form originated and who were the people who popularized it. Students, you would be surprised to know that this form originated in Italy. We are talking about sonnet in English literature, but this form originally came from Italy. It was initiated by a Sicilian lawyer, a lawyer belonging to the place called Sicily, and his name was Lentimer, and he wrote around 1230 AD. But this form, although it was initiated by Lentimer, it was popularized by Petrarch, who arranged his sonnets addressed to his beloved Laura in a sequence called rhyme sparse, which means scattered verses. Now let us see what is important about this. Petrarch is the first poet who not only made this form very popular in Italy, but this form was picked up later by other poets in English literature also. And they followed Petrarch's model of writing several sonnets, arranging them in a sequence. Usually their sonnets were also addressed to some beloved, real or imaginary, and their sonnet sequences gave a kind of story. They could be put in a sequence in an order which gave you a story. So friends, let us revise what we have done so far. We cleared certain basic ideas about poetry. I'm sure all of us had talked about poetry, had read poetry, had understood poetry, but we never talked about the various features of poetry, something which constituted a kind of composition which we called poetry. We also talked about different kinds of poetry. We saw that poetry can be a lyric, it can be a sonnet, it can be a ballad, it can be an elegy, or it can be a poetry of any other kind. So friends, we saw what is a sonnet. We saw that it is a kind of poetry. It originated from Italy, and it was surprising that we are studying it as a part of English literature. So we saw that the sonnet originated in Italy and came to England. It was practiced by many poets. The form was exploited by many English poets. They followed the same conventions and same features which were laid down by the Italian sonnetiers. What were these features? We said that the sonnet had 14 lines, neither 15 nor 13. We also said that it must be addressed to someone. Usually they were love poems, and they were addressed by poets to their beloveds. These beloveds could have been imaginary, or they could have been real people. Then we also somewhere mentioned that they had decasyllabic lines. What does that mean? That meant deca means 10. These lines were of 10 syllables. Earlier when we were talking about poetry, we said that poetry is that form of literature which has music, and this was determined by meter or syllables. So a sonnet form also had music. It was lyrical in character, it was musical, it could be sung, and it had certain features of sound which had certain stress patterns. So these were some of the features of a sonnet. We also saw that it had a rhyming pattern. A particular kind of rhyme determined the kind of sonnet. We also said that the sonnet form came to England, and Petrarch, who was an Italian, was the first person who popularized this form. Friends, you would be surprised to know that the second unit of your syllabus also contains certain sonnets. For example, you have 2 sonnets of Shakespeare prescribed for you and 1 sonnet of Milton also prescribed for you. Just now, when we were talking about the sonnet form, we said that they were love poems. So the sonnets which are of Shakespeare, they come under this category. But when you study Milton's sonnet, it is not a love poem, but Milton is writing about himself. So later on in the second part, when we talk about the sonnet form, you will see what changes occur in the basic pattern of a sonnet. In the second part, you will learn more about not only the sonnet form, but you will also see what is a Petrarchan sonnet. We mentioned Petrarch as the first sonneteer, the first most popular sonneteer. He wrote a kind of sonnet which is now called the Petrarchan sonnet. Then there were many early English sonneteers who followed the Petrarchan model. Either they took the Petrarchan model as itself, or they made certain modifications in this form. So in the subsequent classes, in the subsequent part of this lecture, you would see how this form underwent many changes. Friends, this form is very important in the sense that in the 7th unit, where you study this form as a type of literature, you may be asked to write questions on the form itself or its history, or how the form underwent changes. Underwent changes in the sense that themes went on changing, or the form itself, the rhyming pattern or the syllabic pattern or the metrical pattern, how it went on changing from one sonneteer to another. But it is also important in the sense that Shakespeare is a very famous sonneteer. He not only wrote plays, he also wrote sonnets, and his sonnets are different from what Petrarch did. So this is a kind of form which has a very checkered history. I'm sure you found these little pieces of information useful because they constitute the basis of poetry and the sonnet form. Thank you.
You are just listening an audio program, The Sonnet. Subject, expert and speaker was Dr. Shubra Thripathi. Announcer was Prem Sharan Khemaria. This audio program was edited and presented by Amar Bahadur Yadav. This program was produced by the Electronic Media Production and Research Center, EMPRC of Madhya Pradesh Bhoj Open University in association with NITTTR Bhopal.